All right. Well, today is March 11th, and it is. It is. It's all right. Welcome back. Today is March 10th, and it was on this date that Giovanni de' Medici was chosen as Pope Leo X. He was of the Medici family. If the Medici family first came into power in 1492, if I'm not mistaken, because there were three things that happened in 1492 in world history. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then the Medicis came into power, and the Moors were driven out of Spain. All of this in 1492. Leo X was the Pope of the Reformation, the one that was selling the indulgences that Martin Luther railed against. He was also the Pope who called Henry VIII the defender of the faith. We talked about Henry VIII a while back. Henry VIII, who would later reject the Catholic Church altogether. Speaking of the Reformation, it was on this date in 1559 in response to a sermon by John Knox. Reformation mobs burned Catholic churches in Perth, Scotland. It's always like pointing out this thing that it's, those of us who are Protestants, we like to point out all of the bad deeds that the Catholics or some other religious group has done to we poor Protestants, but we poor Protestants are good at giving it out as well. So they were burning Catholic churches in Perth, Scotland. So that was on this date in 1559. In 1923, hymn writer Mary Ann Thompson died. She was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She's famous. The only hymn I can identify that she wrote is the one, O Zion Haste. O Zion Haste, their mission high fulfilling to tell all the world that God is love. Dun, 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 dun. That was her. Well, she died on this date in 1923. 4 years later, 1927, was the first armored car holdup in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Just watched the movie the other night. That was all about armored car holdups. So that was interesting to me. That was on this date. In 1959, the play Raisin in the Sun opened. Raisin in the Sun was a first Broadway play written by a black woman, Lorraine Hainsbury, who died, unfortunately, shortly thereafter. She died in her mid-30s. I believe she had cancer or something like that. That play went on to do very well. I can't remember if it won I think it won a Tony Award. We saw it. We saw it at the American Players Theater a couple years ago, and then there's a sequel to that play called Clybourne Park that came out like 20 years later, and different author, and it also won a Tony Award. This one is for Debbie. It was on this date in 1983 that in Helsinki, Finland, the introduction and first victory in the Ice Dance Championship by the British ice dancers Torvill and Dean came on. It was also this is the World Championship, went on to the Olympics, but that was on this date in 1983. So that's all I've got for this day. All right, we are in 2 Corinthians, and again, 2 Corinthians is a more personal book. It's a more longer argumentative book than 1 Corinthians was. And so, again, there's a couple of fun passages in here. Well, they're all fun passages, I guess. It's like when a pastor or preacher gets up there and he's preaching away, and then he says, "Now let me get practical." Like, well, what have you been the rest of it? Maybe you should just highlight the big sign. This is the impractical part, and this is the, it's one of my pet peeves. Pain points is the word, right? Pain points, isn't that the new phrase? We don't call them pet peeves anymore. We call them pain points. So last week we talked about 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and Paul was arguing with, or talking about his apostolic gift or his apostolic position. This is something that is still in contention for with the church there. They're making the argument that, well, a real apostle would not have blown us off like you did. And Paul's like, I didn't blow you off. I mean, it's just I didn't want to get there because there would have been a huge fight, and so I sent Titus with a letter instead. And then, so in 2:17, which is where we ended, or he said it ended it to the one talk about how we are an aroma of Christ. And he gives all of these things, and he says, who is equal to this task, such a task at the end of verse 16. And the answer there, and this was kind of the question we ended with last week, is what is the answer to that question? Who is equal to the task? And you could say some of us, none of us. But I think the point that Paul is making there is that he's equal to the task. He's equal to the task. He's the one that's accomplished all of this, which is kind of part of his apostolic defense. I am an apostle. I am one of the 12. I am one of God's chosen here. And he continues that in verse 17, making this distinction. He says, unlike so many, we do not peddle the word of God for profit. I like that phrase. We don't peddle the word of God for profit. And if you think back to Corinthians, if you think back to Acts when Paul was in Corinth, one of the things that he didn't do is he didn't take a salary from them. He did not let them pay him to preach. Okay, so we don't know why it is that Paul in that particular city did not want the Corinthians to pay, but he doesn't. This is where he gets a job working with Aquila and Priscilla as a tent maker. Okay, why? Well, perhaps he knows that there's something about that. He knows that there's there is a certain tension in the whole church universe about being paid to minister, because it's like, okay, well, you hire a minister and you say, okay, we want you to build a church, and this is kind of part of the what every church goes through, not just our church. And then it's like, we want you to build a church, we want you to speak the truth, we want you to come down, pound a few pulpits, that kind of stuff. But don't offend any of the big givers while you're at it, okay? So keep everybody happy. So again, tell the truth, but don't get anybody upset because you don't want to lose any big givers. Rick Warren in his book, the first one he wrote, Purpose-Driven Church. The Purpose-Driven Life is the one that sold a bazillion copies, but the Purpose-Driven Church, in that story, he talks about founding his church and some tension he had. The church was, starting to grow, and there was one person in particular who was clearly a big giver, clearly one of the financial underpinnings. I don't know what the right word was, and but he was also a pain, and so was very critical of him, and so. And he tells a story about how he was very hesitant to confront the guy, because it's like, if I confront the guy and get him mad at me and he leaves, there goes half of our church's income or something like that. Finally he does, and he points out in the book that it was like the best thing that ever happened. And once that guy was out of the way, he was able to do what he wanted to do. But be that as it may, we'll get back onto the topic here now. Paul implies that, and again, it's something about, he says, listen, I'm not out there, peddling my wares here. On the contrary, in Christ, we speak before God with sincerity as those sent from God. Okay, and that in and of itself is kind of the bottom line definition, the specific definition of what an apostle is. Somebody who is sent from God. Which is nowadays, I remember hearing one text I was reading talking about, in contemporary usage, if you think about people, the missionaries are the modern day apostles. These are people sent for a particular purpose, and that's what the apostles in the New Testament were. They were sent by Jesus, go out 2 by 2, and then go you into all the world. He's speaking to the apostles, the 12 disciples, 12 apostles. So again, Paul's like, hey, I'm doing this job that is by definition an apostle. Okay. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Verse 1 of chapter 3. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? Okay. Here again, Paul is, he's dealing with this. How can I prove that I'm an apostle to you? Do you want a letter of recommendation? Okay, so again, this is, it'll be interesting someday. I hope to interview some of the people that were in Corinth someday. So what was the deal between you guys and Paul? What was going on here? It's like, do you need a letter of recommendation? That you yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Okay, so what is Paul's proof of his effectiveness? Paul's proof of his effectiveness is the Corinthian church itself. It's like, what else can I do? You're there because of me. You're my proof. You're the proof that I'm an apostle. If I wasn't an apostle, you wouldn't be there. I was sent from God and the church in Antioch to come out there and visit it. I stayed there a year and a half. I preached. We grew the church. Okay, you guys accepted the Lord, became followers of the way, and you are now my letter. You are my letter of recommendation. Okay, it's interesting. We have a friend of ours who just left the country on us. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. It's like, yeah, you're our good friends. We're just going to leave the country. I'm like permanently left the country. But this is a guy who taught at Moody for a long time, and one of his failures as a Moody professor and as a professional educator was that he never published anything. I think he did like an article here and there, right, or a book review or stuff like that. But he never wrote a book. And it finally came back to haunt him that he had never written a book. Even at Moody, and there was another position. I remember at one point in his life that he was looking for. He was looking for another position at another college, and he was like perfect for it. He fulfilled all of the requirements. It's like he was like just the absolute perfect person for this job, with the exception of the fact that he had never published anything. He had no letter of recommendation. He had no. What is that? And his argument was that I have a network of 2,000 students that I have poured my life into, which is kind of the same argument that Paul is making here. It's like, you are my book. You are my effort here. The guy still hasn't written anything. I don't think he ever is. Mostly because he can't sit still long enough to write a book. I think that's really what the problem is, right? Am I right? Is that, yeah. Oh. Yeah.
Eventually get something down. Kind of like getting my dad to write his autobiography. It didn't happen until after he passed away. My brother gathered everything.
And called it an autobiography, yeah.
And what's his name? That worked for the mission. Actually wrote it.
So he says, verse 4, such confidence we have through Christ before God, not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. He has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now that's a verse that you may have heard at some point. Or at least that phrase, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And when he talks about the new covenant, he's hearkening back to a passage in the book of Jeremiah, and I'm going to turn there. Jeremiah chapter 31. And it's interesting when Paul is talking about this new covenant. Okay, let me read this passage in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 36. Let's see where it goes here. So turn the page. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Okay, so Jeremiah is a prophet to the southern kingdom, I believe, and it's around the time of the takeover. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Okay, so what is this passage all about in Jeremiah 31? Again, he's dealing with people who are either in captivity or on the verge of captivity. Things are, again, when you read the Old Testament prophets, you have to realize kind of the context of, the historical context is things are not working out the way they're supposed to work out. Okay, Israel is supposed to be in ascendancy, and we're supposed to have our God is supposed to be more powerful than all the other gods, and it's just not working out that way. They're looking around and going, wait a minute, why aren't things working out the way we want to? And here Jeremiah is writing, is going, well, there's going to be a new covenant. So something's going to change. There's going to be a new covenant. And what is that new covenant, okay? Well, first of all, it is the divine answer to the ongoing hard-hearted problem in Israel. That hard-hearted problem. If you remember reading, if you know your Old Testament stories, one of the things about it is that they're forever, getting their hearts hardened, and bad things are happening, and they're falling into captivity over and over and over again. Okay, and so it says, no longer will they teach. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. Okay, so at the time of Jeremiah's writing, where was the law written down? On a couple of tablets in the Ark of the Covenant, right? And he says, no, the new covenant, the law is going to be on your hearts. Okay, it's like where does Paul say his message is written? It's just in your heart, right? And so it will never be broken in verse 32. Here it says, it will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes here, how that basically the covenant, the original covenant, the covenant that Jeremiah and Israel and Judah are working under now, was broken pretty much before it even started. I mean, it started out broken. Again, we'll go over that story in a couple of minutes here. But he says this new covenant will never be broken. This is actually one of those one of the verses that if you're talking about assurance of salvation, it's like, the covenant will never be broken, kind of thing. It's like, God decided that I'm not saved anymore. Well, no, it says the covenant will never be broken here. That's one of, it's not the one, it's just kind of one of several. And it says, I will put the law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. So keeping the law will come as a response to redemption. Okay, whereas now redemption comes as a response to keeping the law. Okay, so that's kind of one of the differences. And then of course he says at the end, all God's people will know him. Okay, he's addressing his people. Okay, this isn't necessarily a universalist statement, although there are some that would take this as a text for universalism, that idea that all will be saved eventually, because all will know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Okay, So all God's people will know me. So this is kind of the covenant that even the chief priests and elders would have been aware of, that at some point there's going to be a new covenant, and perhaps they thought this is what's going to happen when the actual Messiah appears. Okay, so in the Jewish context, the Jewish idea was that the Messiah will appear, that will bring in the new covenant, and then everything will work out great for Israel, and everybody will know him, and God will forgive all their wickedness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they expected, again, and we know this from going through the gospel stories, that they expected there to be the Messiah was going to be like a king sitting on a throne. He was going to dispense justice, and everything was going to be perfect, and it didn't work out that way. Okay, but Paul is arguing that Jesus offers this new covenant relationship. Paul is arguing, yeah, you're right. That's how it's going to happen. The Messiah is going to come. It's going to, he's going to bring in the new covenant, and he did. You just don't realize how it works. Okay. So Paul is a minister, i.e., a prophet of this new covenant, a covenant of the Spirit, as opposed to the old covenant, a covenant of the letters. It's written down. The letter, that is the covenant of letters, kills, meaning it just ends in death. They're really, but the new Spirit, the former, that is the new covenant, gives life. Okay, so this isn't an argument, this verse isn't something about, this isn't an argument against legalism. It's not an argument for legalism either. But it isn't like, oh, well, we can't just follow the letter of the law because the Bible says the letter kills, the Spirit gives life. No, this is a comparison between the old covenant and the new covenant. Okay, the old covenant he's calling Spirit. He said, that just kills, that doesn't give life. Paul is going to go on to Romans and say the purpose of the law was to let us know how bad off we were. Nobody can keep the law, so that's what it's for. Okay. Now, if the ministry, verse 7, now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory though it was, will not this ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? Okay, so the next several verses, the next 11 verses, actually the rest of the chapter, are a comparison between Paul's ministry, or the ministry of the Spirit, and the ministry of Moses. Okay, now he's appealing to the Jewish community at this point. Again, remember Corinth is a mixed, okay, but he's using this example to make his point, and he's talking about this contrast with Moses and Jesus. So 3, 7, and 18 are a series of contrasts between Moses, which is the law, and Jesus, which is, and you can put either grace or gospel, either one. You choose. Hey, note taker's choice kind of thing. But first, let's look at a quick review of Exodus 32 through 34, because that's the story that he's talking about here. Exodus, I'll go back to this. And I like this story for no good reason, but I just get a kick out of it. There's one of my favorite phrases in the Bible is in here, is in this particular story. Here they are. So Moses is, here you go, Marty. Moses has brought the people to Mount Sinai, and they're going to go get the law. Okay. Moses is on Mount Sinai, and he's up there. He tells the people, okay, and actually there's an earlier scene which I think is kind of an interesting in the development of how God relates to the people, where he says, oh, God wants to speak to you, and the people are like, no, Moses, you go talk to God. You go talk to God for us. We don't want to approach God ourselves, and I think that's an interesting kind of scene there. But be that as it may, so Moses is going to go up on a mountain to get the law, and in chapter 32, Exodus 32, verse 1, it says, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain. We don't know how long was. Okay. Clearly, it was over a day. I mean, it's probably multiple days. Could have been multiple weeks. Okay. We don't know how long it was, but it was long enough that people are starting to get anxious. Right? So much so that they had pinned all of their religious hopes on Moses. Moses was their connection. Moses was their guy who could talk to God, and so they could see Moses, and Moses could, but with Moses out of the way, they figured maybe he's dead up there. All we know. And so they go to Aaron, and They go to Aaron and they say, come, make us gods who will go before us. Okay, so again, they're not, and we need something to look at. We need something to see here. And so Aaron says, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, or your daughters, et cetera, et cetera. And if you know the story of the Exodus, one of the things that they did was what's called despoiling the Egyptians. They went in and they just like cleaned out. They took a lot of stuff, gold and stuff that was it theirs, or was it like stuff, gold statues on the side of the road? I don't know, but they took a lot of stuff with them. So they had a lot of wealth kind of stuff with them, gold and jewels and things like that. So in verse 4, it says, he took what they handed him and made it into an idol, cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.
That always confused me. Why would Aaron do that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's like
He's there. Yeah.
he's like the second guy. I mean, he's like Moses' right-hand man.
Why does Aaron give? Well, he apparently he is not as into what's going on as you think. And there's no other, he's just like, okay, Aaron says, I'm here with my brother, and maybe he just saw this as a career move for him. I don't know. There's no good explanation why. You'd think he'd have a little more backbone, unless Moses was gone an extremely long time. Could have been 3 months, just long enough so that Aaron believed that he was gone. Okay, and
Really, you don't go that route.
no, you don't. Aaron does.
No, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I can't reconcile it.
So he builds the altar, and he says, tomorrow, verse 5, there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Okay, which this is like most of the potlucks I've ever been to. We sit down, we eat and drink, and we get up and indulge in revelry, kind of thing. But and so there is an argument to be made that he's not. This calf, and perhaps this is what he's thinking, that he's not saying this calf is not necessarily a different God. This is just the representation of the God that has brought you this far. Okay, so, and then of course from the Ten Commandments, you shall have no graven image. There is no image.
They don't have it.
That's true. But that's kind of, is he saying that we should worship a different God, or maybe, and again, there's also the argument that it's actually representative of one of the Egyptian gods. I don't know. I'm just kind of going with this, the basic gist of the story. That's an interesting. Someday I'd like to go through Exodus.
Well, that's the other thing. When they got out in the desert, then they wanted to go back. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden they had short memories of what it was like in Egypt.
So Aaron at the request makes a golden calf. Okay, so again, and we know that one of the things is that should have no graven images, no graven images. And I don't, I got to believe that this is something that throughout up to this point, there had never been a reference to a graven image or any kind of an idol or any kind of a statue representing God up to this point. So I think this was kind of a given, and maybe it was something that bugged the Egyptian or the Israelites at the time. That hey, why don't we have all the other gods have statues? why don't we have one as well? And so then, in other words, so the point is, and then Egypt, or I'm sorry, Moses comes down from the mountain. I'll just kind of fast forward, and we know the story. Moses he's up there on a mountain, and God says, "Hey, it sounds like battle down there. You better go." And that's how much revelry was going on. Okay, so he goes down the mountain. He sees what's going on. And he tells him, he says, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.'" So who's he actually quoting there? God is actually quoting Aaron. "I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." Which is really, this is an offer you can't refuse. But Moses kind of says, no, Lord, it'll look bad. The optics will be bad if you kill off these people here, okay? You can't do that. And he comes down, and at the end of chapter 15, when Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, "There is a sound of war in the camp." Moses replied, "It is not the sound of victory. It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing." Okay, so verse 19, when Moses approached the camp and saw the camp and the dancing, his anger burned, and he realized, okay, what God was talking about. See, I think Moses, in this discussion, is thinking, no way, God, this can't be. No, it's not that bad. Aaron's down there. My right-hand guy is down there keeping an eye on things. It's not as bad as you think. Okay, so he gets down there, and so his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hand, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. So in other words, and this is the example that Paul is referring back to, they haven't even seen the covenant, and it's broken. Okay, it's broken before it began. And then he says, and they said to me, and then I just get a kick out of this. "Do not be angry, my Lord," Aaron answered. So he goes, verse 21, he said to Aaron, "What did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin?" Okay, what's going on? That's an interesting thing. I think he's kind of thinking that they must have tied you up and threatened you with death, because certainly you wouldn't have done this on your own. I mean, I think that's he's giving them an out. They forced me. They held a gun to my head. They held a spear to my head. They said I had to do it. And so Aaron's response, I just get a kick out of this. It's just like the lamest response in the Bible. I'm sorry, that's the technical term. "Do not be angry, my Lord. You know how prone these people are to evil." Okay. "They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us.' As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." So I told them, "Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off." Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Like, seriously, Moses, look, I was just assuaging them. I was just buying time. I just threw it in. I figured that would keep them. And all of a sudden, it magically formed into this golden calf kind of thing. And so Moses goes and he grinds up the calf and pours it in the water, makes everybody drink it, and all that kind of stuff. But the quick review of Exodus 32 through 34. Moses is on Mount Sinai, and it's taken a long time to return. So Aaron, at the people's request, makes a golden calf. Okay, so the earlier text makes it really clear. And again, Moses is the one that's telling the story, right? So this is Moses' account of what's happening. So Moses knows. He gets the truth out of Aaron, that it isn't, it says earlier that he crafted the golden calf. He made the mold. So again, this is something that would take him a certain amount of time. You have to create, you're in the desert, so you've got sand to make a mold out of, and then you have to make the mold and you have to size it. And this is like I can't imagine this is just something you would do in a couple hours in the afternoon. Okay, which kind of gives you an idea of how long Moses was gone, that long enough for him to do all of this. But then, so he gets the story, and I don't know if Moses is writing this down, I'm wondering if he's snickering at this point, or telling the story, going, "Yeah, and this is what Aaron said. Can you believe this is what Aaron tells me?" I threw the gold into the fire, and out came this calf. Out came this calf. Kind of reminds you. Remember there used to be a commercial on TV, and I can't remember what it was selling, but there was one of the scenes in the commercial. There was a kid standing in a bedroom that was just a disaster area, and the mom says to the kid, "What happened? What happened in here?" And the kid's standing in the middle of this, just this mess, and the kid just says, "Nothing." Does anybody remember that commercial? Little kid, just nothing, kind of thing. But so God's Sinai covenant with Israel was broken almost as soon as it starts. Did it even start? Does Moses even get a chance to come down and explain to the people and say, okay, here's how it's going to work? No, because they've already abandoned Moses' leadership. Okay? But Moses intercedes for the people, despite their now being the laughing stock, and that's how it's translated in the NIV, to their enemies at this point. So Moses goes back up to the mountain. This is interesting. I didn't realize this. Maybe you've gone through Exodus, right, with one of your classes? But Moses goes back up to get the second set of laws. And when he comes down, his face, let's see here, his face is radiant. This is where the face is glowing. Let me find this. I think this is in the New Stone Tablets. When Moses, chapter 34, beginning with verse 29, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hand, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. Now, apparently the first time it wasn't radiant because he was angry, or they didn't see it or whatever. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, so Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back, and he spoke to them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near, and he gave them the commands. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil on his face. Okay? So, but whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord. So after this, so it's like this was an ongoing thing with Moses. You kind of think when you hear this story, and I always thought this story, that when Moses came down the first time, his face, having been that close to God, that his face was glowing or shining, and and then it just kind of went away. Well, it doesn't. Okay, so it's like every time he goes into the tabernacle, his face is shining. He has to wear a veil. Like, for all we know, for the rest of his life, he has to wear this veil because he's been with God, and he can only take it off when he goes into the tabernacle, when he's back in the presence of God. Okay, so this veil, this is important because and everybody knows about this veil, because now Paul is going to go back to this veil, that there's this veil between Moses and the people. So whenever they talk to Moses from this point on, he's got a veil on. That's how I'm seeing it. Okay, he's wearing this veil. They can't look at him directly because he's been with God. Okay. So when he returns with the second set of laws, Moses' face is radiant, shining. This becomes an ongoing thing with Moses. Okay. Now back in 2 Corinthians, Paul uses a how much more than kind of. Back in 2 Corinthians, Paul uses a how much more than argument. Okay, and a how much more than argument goes, if this is true, how much more is this true? Okay, if I was willing to do this for you then, when it was difficult, how much more than that would I do now because it's easy? Or something along that line. You get the idea of the argument structure. How much more than? Okay, so Paul comes back and he says, now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? Okay, so again, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talked about the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So Paul is he's like, the glory of God's presence in the Old Testament had to be hidden because of this veil, or had to be hidden because they couldn't deal with it, so it was hidden by this veil. For what was glorious has no glory. I'm sorry, where am I? Will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that brought condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now, that is, meaning the Spirit, the letter, in comparison with the surpassing glory, the glory we have now. And if what was transitory came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? Therefore, since we have a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the Old Covenant is read. Okay, so there's still this veil, if you're looking at the Old Testament, that he's using this veil as a metaphor to say there's still something between, there still needs to be something in between the presence of God and you, represented by this veil in the Old Testament. But what happens, remember when Jesus is crucified, what happens to the temple? What happens to the temple? Right, from top to bottom. It's an important point, because if men would have picked it up from the bottom and ripped it. Okay, but it was ripped from the top to the bottom. Okay, so that veil was ripped apart. That separation in the temple was ripped apart. That veil that Moses had to keep in front of his face is gone. It says, even to this day when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Okay, so this is is sort of echoing like what the writer of Hebrews is going to talk about, the superiority of the new covenant, how much better it is now. Okay, so if Moses' ministry brought glory, how much more than that is it that the Spirit will bring glory? So these first three verses here bring out the superiority of the ministry of the Spirit. Moses had to veil his face because the Israelites' minds were dull. The implication in the next couple of verses is that the veil still covers the old, that is, the Mosaic covenant. We call it the Old Covenant. They didn't call it the Old, they didn't realize it was the Old Covenant at that point. Paul is pointing out to them, hey, we've moved into the next phase. Okay, we've moved into the new covenant. Okay. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. That freedom, what is that freedom that we have? And again, that's the passage that you hear. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Okay, usually it's talking, you hear that when, like on God and Country Sundays, it's like, oh, this is why we need to, this freedom. It's like, no. Far be it from me to suggest that we misuse verses on these God and Country. I mean, this church hasn't. Has anybody been in a God and Country kind of Sunday thing? With this new Spirit, we have freedom. And again, you can compare Hebrews 4:16, where we boldly approach the throne of grace kind of thing. What freedom is that? Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. What freedom? We have the freedom now, under this new covenant, thanks to the work of Paul, to contemplate the Lord's glory and be continually transformed into His image. So where the Spirit of the Lord is, and we can see it, we have the freedom to become more like Christ. Not more able to keep and bear arms, to be more like Christ. Okay? And if what Paul says is true here, and I'll finish with this, for two reasons. One, it's 10 o'clock, and two, it's my last line. If what Paul says is true, and the Corinthians would have understood that, and I believe it is, then his underlying argument that he's telling you this, he's sent from God to tell you this, which supports his apostle, his being an apostle, apostolicity kind of thing. Okay. Any questions?
So just a clarification.
when they say Old Covenant, they're strictly talking about the Mosaic Covenant. Abraham's covenant is still old.
Yes. Yes.
I just had a thought, this ending passage, being transformed into his image, that kind of ties back to the Moses story too, because the reason God didn't want graven images made was his image at creation was stamped on mankind.
But we are the image.
We are his image, yes.
Yeah.
And through Christ, we are being transformed into that image.
Debbie will be teaching next week. No, just kidding. I could step aside and go, and now for the commentary,
What's the date gonna be next week? No.
Yeah.
I might get that right.
Republican rebuttal.
Yeah, yeah. All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll see you all next week.